Still having trouble controlling that?
I could control it if I wanted to.
Your tail again?
Ignore it, Lieutenant.
Listen to our stories for free on Spotify. Thank you to our Patreon members for making these stories possible. Scan the QR code on screen for exclusive photos and videos.
Commander Vaelira Thesson had commanded 3 ships, survived 2 mutinies, and once talked down a Rehari warlord using nothing but a steady voice and a data slate full of bluffs. She had a reputation across 7 systems for being unshakable. Officers who served under her said she could deliver news of a hull breach in the same flat, composed tone she used to order breakfast. Junior recruits were told, on their first day aboard the Solen Vale, that Commander Thesson had once finished a full tactical briefing during an active hull fire without raising her voice once. Her tail had never once cared about her reputation. It was a magnificent tail, russet gold with a cream-colored tip, the kind of tail that other Vulpine officers admired at formal functions and that new recruits stared at a beat too long before remembering themselves. Among her own people, a tail like Vaelira's was considered a mark of good breeding and better discipline. Sleek, well-muscled, capable of the kind of controlled, minimal movement that signaled a Vulpine who had mastered herself completely. Vaelira had spent her entire adult life cultivating exactly that reputation. Her tail moved in short, measured arcs. It never drooped in disappointment where a subordinate might see. It never lashed in anger where a rival might read weakness. For 31 years, that discipline had been absolute, drilled into her from her earliest cadet days at the Calethorn Academy, where instructors had rapped canes against unruly tails until the lesson took root. The tail obeys the officer, not the other way around. Then Lieutenant Daniel Cross transferred aboard the Solen Vale, and her tail forgot every rule it had ever followed. It started small. A twitch when he walked past her on the bridge. Nothing, surely, the kind of reflexive motion any tail made 100 times a day. Then a slow drift toward the communications station whenever she had no professional reason to be near it, a habit she noticed only because Petrick Don, her first officer, began raising an eyebrow at her every time she happened to be reviewing status reports directly behind Daniel's chair. She told herself it was nothing. Tails moved constantly, an extension of nerve and instinct, no more meaningful than a human's fingers tapping a console in an idle moment. But tails did not lie, not even to their owners, and Vaelira knew the old truth as well as any Vulpine, had known it since she was small enough to trip over her own. A tail leans toward what its owner wants most, whether or not the owner is willing to admit it. She simply refused to believe that applied to her. Commander. Daniel's voice, easy and low, pulled her attention from the tactical display. He stood at parade rest beside her chair, tablet in hand, dark hair mussed from 12 hours on shift. Encrypted packet from Fleet Command. Priority 2, not urgent enough to wake you at 0300, but I figured you'd want it before the briefing. Thank you, Lieutenant. She kept her eyes on the display. Her tail did not. It slid from beneath her chair, unhurried, deliberate, and curled around the leg of his boot with the casual ownership of something that had done this 100 times before. Daniel, to his credit, did not so much as glance down. He had learned, over the past few months, to let these moments pass without comment, the same way one might ignore a friend's nervous habit, though the flush that crept faintly up the back of his neck suggested it was not quite as unremarkable to him as he pretended. Vaelira felt the warmth of contact travel up through her spine before her mind had even registered what her tail had done. She reached down without looking, closed her hand around the traitorous appendage, and drew it back beneath her seat like a soldier hauling in a rogue flag. "Will that be all, Commander?" "That will be all." He left. Her tail immediately turned to watch him go, its cream-colored tip tapping once, softly, against the deck plating. A motion so small that only someone fluent in the old tail language would have recognized it as a word at all. It meant, roughly, come back. Vaelira did not know that Daniel understood exactly what it meant. She would have been mortified to learn it. He, for his part, had turned the corner before allowing himself to exhale. Commander Vaelira Thesson was, by any measure, an exceptional officer. She had graduated top of her class at the Calethorn Fleet Academy, the youngest Vulpine in a decade to be given independent command, and she ran the Solen Vale with a precision that made even the ship's aging reactor core behave itself under her watch, though Orsa Venik would have argued that was more her own doing than any commander's influence. Vaelira did not believe in wasted motion, wasted words, or wasted feelings. She ate the same breakfast every morning at the same hour. She reviewed the same reports in the same order. She had built her entire career on the principle that predictability, in a commander, was a kind of safety for everyone under her. She had also spent the last 4 months rearranging furniture to keep her tail away from a human communications officer, and she was losing. It began, if she was honest with herself, on his second week aboard. There had been a reactor fluctuation. Nothing catastrophic, a coolant regulator sticking under thermal stress, but enough to rattle the crew and send 2 junior engineers scrambling for the escape pods before Orsa barked them back to their stations. Daniel Cross had stayed at his post through the entire 11 minutes of uncertainty, relaying updates between the bridge and engineering in a voice so calm it had steadied half the crew without him ever raising it above a conversational tone. Vaelira remembered looking over at him mid-crisis, expecting to see the particular brittle fear that new transfers so often wore during their first real emergency, and instead finding a young man methodically doing his job as though the ship's survival were simply another item on a checklist he intended to complete without fuss. She had thought, in the practical, appraising way she thought about all useful things aboard her ship, that is a good officer. Her tail had thought something else entirely, and it had never really stopped thinking it since. She tried logic first, because logic had never failed her before. Interspecies attraction between Vulpine and human personnel was not forbidden. The Union had long since normalized such pairings, and half the senior staff at Fleet Command could point to a human or Vulpine spouse waiting at home, but it was, in her professional opinion, inconvenient. A commanding officer did not develop feelings for a lieutenant 3 ranks her junior, assigned to her own vessel, subject to her own chain of command. A commanding officer certainly did not allow said lieutenant to catch her tail curling around his ankle like some lovesick cadet fresh out of the Academy's first-year dormitories. So she rearranged the bridge. She moved Daniel's console 11 centimeters to the left, citing improved sightlines to the auxiliary display, a justification so thin that Petrick had simply nodded and said nothing, which was somehow worse than if he'd argued. She began carrying data tablets against her hip on his side, a makeshift barrier that fooled absolutely no one. She took to standing with her back to walls during briefings, tail pinned flat against the bulkhead where it could not wander, a posture that made her look, Orsa observed dryly, like a woman perpetually bracing for an ambush. She told herself this was tactical positioning. She told herself a great many things that spring. "You've moved that boy's station 4 times this month," Orsa said one evening in the officers' mess, not looking up from her tea. Orsa Venik was a blunt old Vulpine, silver threading through the auburn of her fur, who had served with Vaelira for 11 years and had long since earned the right to say things no one else on the ship would dare. "Twice you cited radiation shielding. We are not carrying anything radioactive on this vessel, Commander. I would know. I run the reactor. Structural integrity is not your department, Orsa." "No," Orsa agreed placidly. "But tails are everyone's department, Commander." "Yours has been trying to walk itself into that man's quarters since the Farai Nebula crossing. The whole engineering deck has a betting pool going. I'd stay out of it, if I were you. The smart money's not in your favor." Vaelira did not dignify this with a response. Her tail, unhelpfully, curled tighter around the leg of her chair, as if in agreement with Orsa, and its cream tip drummed a slow, thoughtful rhythm against the deck. The old word for soon, spoken in a language Vaelira had spent 31 years mastering and had apparently forgotten how to control. Daniel Cross had not joined the fleet to fall in love with his commanding officer. He had joined because he was good with languages, better with codes, and had grown up on a border colony where half his neighbors were Vulpine, and he'd learned tail language before he'd learned cursive, sitting on his grandmother's porch watching the neighborhood children signal secrets to each other across the yard with flicks and curls their parents pretended not to notice. It was a skill nobody on the Solen Vale knew he possessed, and he intended to keep it that way, because the alternative, admitting that he understood every single thing his commanding officer's tail had been telling him for 4 months, was unbearable. He had noticed Commander Thesson's tail on his second day aboard, a passing flick in his direction that he'd dismissed as nothing. He had noticed it specifically directed at him by the end of his second week, and had spent that entire third week convincing himself he was imagining things, that a tail could not possibly mean what tail language said it meant when its owner's face remained so perfectly, coldly composed. He had spent every day since pretending he hadn't noticed at all, because Vaelira Thesson was a decorated commander with a spotless record and a bearing that made grown officers straighten their spines just walking past her, and he was a communications lieutenant who had transferred in from a supply frigate after a court-martial scare that hadn't been his fault but had followed him anyway. And there was no version of that math that ended with him. So he said nothing. He let her tail brush his leg in passing and kept his eyes on his console. He let it curl around chair legs beside him during briefings and kept his voice level when he gave his reports, even when the tip tapped out words only he could read, "Stay closer, please," words no commanding officer would ever say aloud to a subordinate 3 ranks beneath her. He told himself, over and over, in the privacy of his own quarters at the end of every shift, that it meant nothing. That tails moved on their own, that he was reading meaning into reflex, that a woman like Vaelira Thesson did not lie awake thinking about a communications officer who couldn't even keep his own transfer record clean. He was, of course, wrong about all of it. But he was very good at lying to himself, almost as good as she was, and for 4 months the two of them orbited each other in careful, deliberate silence, 2 disciplined people each convinced the other could not possibly want what their own instincts kept insisting was true. The court-martial scare that had followed him from the supply frigate Meridian's Rest was, in the end, a small and almost forgettable thing. A communications error during a routine cargo transfer that had briefly implicated him in a smuggling investigation before the actual culprit, a warrant officer with a gambling debt and access to the manifest logs, was identified and dealt with. Daniel had been cleared entirely within 3 weeks. But 3 weeks was long enough for the accusation to follow him in whispered form to his next posting, long enough that he had boarded the Solen Vale half expecting his new commanding officer to have already read the file and formed her opinion before he'd said a single word to her. Vaelira had read the file, of course. She read every file for every officer who transferred aboard her ship, a habit born of thoroughness rather than suspicion. She had noted the investigation, noted its resolution, and noted, with the particular attentiveness she brought to personnel matters, that the young lieutenant's record showed no pattern of the kind of behavior that led to genuine misconduct, only a young man who had been unlucky enough to work near someone else's crime. She had never once mentioned it to him. He had spent his first month aboard bracing for a conversation that never came, and had slowly come to realize, watching her treat him with exactly the same brisk professionalism she extended to every other officer under her command, that Commander Thesson either had not read the file or did not consider it worth holding against him. It was, in its own quiet way, one of the first things that had made him trust her. Long before he understood that trust was rapidly becoming something else entirely. "You never asked me about the Meridian's Rest investigation," he mentioned once, months into his posting, during one of their late-shift silences on the bridge, more curious than accusatory. "I read the report, Lieutenant. There was nothing in it worth asking about." Vaelira had not looked up from her own console. "I do not generally interrogate officers about matters that were already resolved by a competent investigating board. It strikes me as redundant, and faintly insulting to the board's work. Most commanders would have brought it up, just to watch how I reacted. I am not most commanders." A pause, and then, with the faintest trace of something that might have been humor. Though I confess I did wonder, briefly, whether a man cleared of smuggling might make an interesting addition to a bridge crew that has, on occasion, needed someone willing to bend a regulation or two in an emergency. Daniel had laughed, surprised into it, and Vaelira's tail, he would only realize much later, looking back, had curled, just slightly, toward the sound. It was not only her tail that betrayed her, though Vaelira would have preferred to blame it exclusively, if only because a single traitor was easier to court-martial than an entire body in quiet mutiny. There were her ears as well, which every Vulpine child was taught to guard even more carefully than the tail, because ears were faster, harder to control, and gave away far more in far less time. Vulpine ears did not lather. A relaxed ear, loose and slightly forward, meant contentment. An ear pinned flat back meant fear or fury, and any cadet who let their ears betray true anger during a superior officer's dressing down learned quickly to master the muscles that governed them. But there was a third position, subtler than either, that Vaelira had not needed to guard against since she was perhaps 19 years old and hopelessly infatuated with an upperclassman who never once looked at her twice. The soft, forward tilt, ears angled toward a particular person the way a plant turned toward light, an expression of interest so unguarded that most Vulpine learned to suppress it by adulthood, the same way they learned to suppress the urge to purr in public. Vaelira's ears had started doing it again around the same time her tail had. She caught herself at it during the 3rd week of the 5th month. Leaning very slightly forward during a routine status briefing, ears tilted toward Daniel's station though her eyes remained fixed dutifully on the tactical display, and only realized what she was doing when Petrick cleared his throat with unnecessary volume, and she snapped back into a posture so rigid it drew a raised eyebrow from 2 junior officers. "You're doing the ears again," Petrick murmured to her later, in the privacy of the ready room, with the particular gentleness he reserved for moments when he genuinely worried about her rather than merely enjoyed her discomfort. "Vaelira, this has been going on for months. At some point the crew stops finding it charming and starts finding it exhausting to watch you fight yourself. I am not fighting anything, Petrick. I am maintaining professional composure. You rearranged the auxiliary console for the 3rd time this quarter to keep him 11 centimeters further from your chair. That is not composure. That is a woman building a wall 1 centimeter at a time and hoping no one notices the foundation is made entirely of denial." Vaelira did not answer that. There was, she reflected privately, very little she could say to a man who had known her for 11 years and had apparently spent every one of them quietly cataloging her tells. The worst of it, the part she would never have admitted to Petrick, or to Orsa, or to anyone aboard the Solène Vale, was the purring. Vulpine purred involuntarily under 2 conditions: deep physical comfort, the kind reserved for private moments among family or trusted intimates, and the presence of someone whose nearness registered, on some level below conscious thought, as safety. It was considered deeply improper to purr in front of anyone outside one's closest circle. Academy instructors had drilled the suppression technique into every cadet with the same rigor they applied to weapons drills, because an uncontrolled purr in the wrong company could reveal far more than any officer intended. Vaelira had not purred in front of another living soul since she was perhaps 14 years old. She had caught herself starting to, twice now, in Daniel's presence. Once during a quiet moment in the officer's mess when he made some dry, understated joke about the ship's aging replicators, and once during a late shift status update when he'd simply stood beside her chair long enough that some part of her nervous system had apparently decided he belonged there. Both times she had swallowed the sound before it could fully form, throat tight with the effort, and both times Daniel had glanced at her with an expression she couldn't quite read. Not surprise, exactly. Something closer to hope, quickly hidden. She did not know that he recognized the sound for what it almost was. She would have been mortified to learn that, too. There was, in those middle months, a particular evening Vaelira would return to often in later years, though she rarely admitted it aloud even to herself. It had been an unremarkable shift, the kind that filled most of a career, Routine patrol along a quiet trade corridor, no threats on the sensors, nothing requiring the crisp, decisive competence she was known for. She had stayed later than necessary reviewing supply manifests in her ready room, and Daniel had stayed later than necessary finishing a translation backlog at the communication station just beyond her door, and somewhere around the third hour of companionable silence between them, she had realized she was no longer reading the manifests at all. She had simply been listening to him work. The soft, steady rhythm of his hands on the console. The occasional low hum he made under his breath when a translation resisted him, a habit she suspected he didn't know he had. The particular quality of quiet that settled over a ship's bridge in the deep hours of a night shift, when most of the crew slept and the two of them were, for all practical purposes, alone with the stars. She had gone to the doorway of her ready room, ostensibly to stretch her legs, and had stood there for longer than any reasonable stretch required, watching him work by the low light of his console, her tail curled loosely and entirely without her permission around the doorframe. "Problem, Commander?" he'd asked, without looking up, though the faint quirk of his mouth suggested he'd known she was there for some time. "No problem, Lieutenant. Carry on." She had gone back to her manifests. She had not, in fact, read a single further word of them that night. She had simply sat in her ready room with the door open, listening to him work, and had told herself, as she told herself so many things that spring, that it meant nothing at all. It was, she would later admit to Daniel, the night she had first allowed herself to imagine what it might be like if her tail were permitted to say what it wanted, out loud, without 4 decades of discipline standing in the way. Word came down from Fleet Command in the 4th month of Daniel's assignment. The Solène Vale would host a formal inspection ahead of the Union's spring diplomatic circuit, timed to coincide with the early weeks of choosing season, the period in the Vulpine calendar when courtships were traditionally acknowledged. When tales that had spent a year quietly declaring their preferences in private were finally permitted to do so in public without scandal. Choosing season carried old weight among Vulpine crews. Even aboard a vessel as disciplined as the Solène Vale, junior officers exchanged small tokens during the season, tail touches lingered a beat longer than strict regulation allowed, and senior staff generally looked the other way, because everyone remembered being young once and everyone understood that a tail did not check the duty roster before it decided who it wanted. Vaelira received the news with the enthusiasm of someone being told her ship had contracted a slow leak. "Choosing season," she repeated flatly, staring at the notice on her ready room display. "Of all the seasons to schedule an inspection. Bad timing, Commander?" asked Petrick, who had known her long enough to enjoy her discomfort more than was strictly professional, and who settled into the chair across from her desk with the unhurried air of a man who intended to make the most of this conversation. "The timing is irrelevant. I am not participating in choosing season. Your tail may disagree." "My tail," said Vaelira, with the particular iciness she usually reserved for insubordinate ensigns, "does not command this vessel." Petrick wisely said nothing further. But he did glance down, just once, to where her tail had curled itself thoughtfully around the leg of her desk, its cream-color tip tapping a slow, contemplative rhythm against the deck plating, the same rhythm it had used weeks earlier in the corridor outside communications, a rhythm that, in the old tail language every Vulpine child learned before they could walk, meant something very close to soon. "You know," Petrick said, rising to leave, pausing at the door with the particular casualness of a man about to say something he knew would land. "Orsa's betting pool has moved the odds twice this month. You're not fooling engineering, Commander. You're barely fooling the cargo bay. Get off my bridge, Petrick. We're in your ready room. Get off my ship, then, if it comes to that." He left, laughing, and Vaelira spent a long moment glaring at her tail as though it might, through sheer force of will, be persuaded to feel shame. It did not. It simply kept tapping, patient and unbothered, the same single word it had been repeating for weeks. Choosing season, for those who had not grown up among Vulpine, was a peculiar tradition to witness. It was not a single ceremony but a slow accumulation of small, deliberate acts spread across the season's 6 weeks, The exchange of a woven cord dyed in one's family colors, the sharing of a meal prepared with one's own hands rather than replicated, the quiet, public acknowledgement of a tale's preference that had, until that point, been considered a private matter between an individual and their own instincts. Among fleet crews, the tradition had softened over the generations into something more informal. Junior officers exchanged small tokens, senior staff looked the other way when courtships bloomed a little more visibly than usual, and by the season's end, at least a handful of new bondings were typically announced across any given ship. Vaelira had, in her 31 years, never once participated. She had attended other officers' choosing ceremonies as a guest, had offered the traditional toasts, had even, on one memorable occasion at the academy, been asked to stand witness for a classmate's bonding. She had never imagined herself on the other side of the ceremony. Command, she had told herself for the better part of a decade, was itself a kind of choosing. The thing she had selected above all else, the thing her tail was permitted to curl around instead of a person, wrapped contentedly around the arm of her command chair during quiet shifts, as though the ship itself were partner enough. It was Orsa, in the days following the Admiral's arrival, who first said aloud what half the crew had already begun whispering. "You know the season doesn't care whether you participate on purpose," the engineer said, elbow deep in a coolant regulator, not bothering to look up as Vaelira passed through engineering on her evening rounds. "It only cares whether your tail's already made its choice. And yours made its choice back around the Ferry Crossing, Commander, same as the rest of us noticed. The season's just going to keep being uncomfortable until you catch up to it." "I was not aware engineering had taken up amateur courtship counseling, Orsa. We took it up the day you started inventing radiation hazards to avoid moving your own chair 11 centimeters closer to a man you clearly wanted within arm's reach. Someone had to say something, Commander. Might as well be me. I've got seniority and nothing left to lose." Vaelira had not dignified that with a response either. But she had noticed, walking the rest of her rounds that evening, that her tail had curled once, briefly, around the leg of the communications console as she passed it, empty at that hour, Daniel long since off shift, and she had let it linger there a moment longer than strict necessity required before continuing on her way. The admiral chosen to conduct the inspection was a formidable old Vulpine named Ressa Caloran, silver-furred and sharp-eyed, a veteran of the Union's early expansion wars who had inspected more ships than she could count and had developed, over the decades, an uncanny ability to read a crew's true temperament within the first hour aboard, regardless of how carefully that crew had rehearsed their performance for her benefit. She arrived on the Solène Vale with 2 aides, a data case full of regulations, and absolutely no patience for pretense. "Commander Thesson." Admiral Caloran's greeting was crisp, her handshake firm, her eyes already moving across the assembled senior staff with the swift, assessing glance of someone cataloging weaknesses before the tour had even begun. "Your record precedes you. I'm told you run the tightest bridge in the sector. I do my best, Admiral." "I'm sure you do." Caloran's eyes flicked, briefly, downward, a habit so old and so automatic among Vulpine officers that Vaelira barely registered it, the reflexive check every senior Vulpine performed on meeting another, a quick read of posture and tail position that most conducted without conscious thought. Then the Admiral's gaze sharpened, and she looked again, longer this time, her attention snagging on something, and Vaelira felt the first faint prickle of alarm crawl up the back of her neck. Her tail was doing something. She could feel it moving, feel the telltale drift toward the communications station where Daniel stood monitoring the docking sequence with his back deliberately turned, and she willed it, silently, furiously, with every ounce of the discipline that had carried her through 31 years of service, to stop. It did not stop. It never did. "Interesting," Admiral Caloran murmured, and said nothing more, but Vaelira spent the rest of the tour with her stomach in a slow, cold knot, and her tail wound so tightly around the leg of her own chair that by the time the Admiral moved on to inspect the mess hall, she'd have sworn she could feel the ache of it in her spine. The inspection proceeded on the surface, without incident. Admiral Caloran reviewed maintenance logs with an engineer's thoroughness, inspected the engine room while Orsa hovered nearby offering commentary the Admiral clearly found more entertaining than most engineers' reports, and questioned junior officers about protocol with the brisk efficiency of someone who had done this 1,000 times and intended to be done with it quickly. She was, by all appearances, entirely focused on her task. She was also, Vaelira came to realize with mounting dread as the day wore on, watching her tail the entire time. It happened on the bridge, during the final stage of the inspection, in front of most of the senior staff and 2 visibly nervous junior officers who had drawn the misfortune of being on shift for the Admiral's tour. Daniel had approached to deliver a status report. Routine, unremarkable, exactly the kind of interaction that happened a dozen times a shift, the kind of interaction Vaelira had convinced herself, over 4 months, that she had learned to manage. Her tail, with the perfect timing of a saboteur who had been waiting all day for precisely this opportunity, chose that exact moment to uncurl from beneath her chair, cross 4 meters of open deck, and wind itself firmly around Daniel's ankle, tip curling up along the line of his calf with unmistakable, unhurried intention. The bridge did not exactly go silent. But several officers found sudden, urgent reasons to study their consoles, and one ensign near the tactical station developed a coughing fit that fooled absolutely no one. Admiral Caloran watched the whole thing with the expression of someone confirming a suspicion she'd already formed hours earlier, and had simply been waiting for the crew to prove correct. She had, in fact, noted the tail's behavior during the very first hour of her tour, and had spent the balance of the day's inspection quietly testing her theory, lingering a beat longer than necessary near the communications station during her review of the ship's logs, watching from the corner of her eye as Vaelira's composure strained visibly at the proximity, noting the exact moment the commander's tail began its slow, deliberate drift toward the lieutenant during the tactical briefing. It was, Caloran reflected privately, one of the more thorough tail confessions she had witnessed in 4 decades of inspections, rivaled only by a memorable incident early in her own career involving a supply officer, a cargo manifest, and an engineering ensign who had never quite lived down the resulting gossip. Then, in a voice pitched just quietly enough to be private and just clearly enough to be devastating, she asked, "Commander, when is the bonding ceremony?" Vaelira's composure. 4 decades in the making, tested by combat, mutiny, and diplomatic disaster, tested by a career's worth of crises she had weathered without ever once raising her voice, cracked directly down the middle, right there on her own bridge, in front of her own crew. "There is no ceremony, Admiral. My tail is—" She stopped. Started again, aware of how thin the ice beneath the words had become. "There has clearly been some manner of neural. Tails do not malfunction, Commander Thesson." Admiral Caloran's voice was not unkind, but it was final, the voice of a woman who had raised 3 children and outlived 2 husbands and had no patience left for a proud officer's denial. They simply tell the truth before the officer attached to them is ready to. "I've seen it 100 times, Commander, in officers twice your age. It never gets less obvious, and it never gets more graceful. You may as well stop fighting it in front of witnesses. You're only making the coughing ensign's job harder." Vaelira looked down. Her tail, apparently unbothered by the Admiral's presence or her commander's mortification, had settled into a slow, contented curl around Daniel's leg, its tip tapping the same soft rhythm it had used in her ready room, the same word it had been saying for weeks. Soon. She hauled it back with more force than was strictly dignified, aware of the color rising in her own face, aware, worse, of the faint, helpless heat in her own ears, which had, she realized with fresh horror, tilted forward the entire time. "A malfunction," she said again, to no one in particular, and requested, with as much composure as she could still muster, which was not a great deal, that the inspection proceed to the cargo bay. Daniel had heard the whole exchange. Of course he had. He'd been standing directly beside her, her tail wrapped around his ankle like a physical confession in front of the Admiral of the fleet and half the bridge crew, and there was no version of that moment, that could have passed him by unnoticed, no matter how hard he tried to keep his own expression neutral through it. He found her an hour later in the observation corridor outside the bridge, staring out at the slow wheel of stars with the particular stillness of someone holding themselves very carefully together, tail wrapped so tightly around her own leg that it looked almost painful. "Commander." He kept his distance, kept his voice gentle, the same calm register he'd used through the reactor fluctuation all those months ago, the register that had first caught her attention and never quite let it go. "For what it's worth, I've known for a while." Her spine went rigid. "Known what, Lieutenant?" "That your tail does that. Around me." He exhaled, and some of the careful composure he'd maintained for 4 months went with it. His own ears, she noticed, distantly, through the fog of her own mortification, tilted forward, unguarded, in a way he clearly hadn't intended to let show. "I noticed weeks ago. I speak tail language, Vaelira. I grew up on a border colony. Half my neighbors were Vulpine. I didn't say anything because—" He hesitated, and for the first time since she'd known him, Daniel Cross looked genuinely uncertain, the calm cracking at last. "Because I didn't want to embarrass you. And because I couldn't imagine why someone like you would want someone like me." Vaelira turned to face him fully for the first time since the bridge, something in her chest tightening at the admission. Not just that he'd known, but how long, and how carefully he'd guarded it, the same way she had. "My tail," she said very quietly, "does not consult me before it acts. I know. That does not mean it is wrong, Lieutenant. It simply means it is early. And undisciplined. And entirely unprofessional, given the timing, and the audience, and the fact that an admiral of the fleet now believes I am planning a bonding ceremony I have not, as of this conversation, actually agreed to." Daniel almost smiled, despite everything, despite the wreck of the afternoon. "Is that an apology?" "It is a fact." But her tail, curling loosely near her feet now that the immediate crisis had passed, betrayed the faintest tremor of something that was not quite as composed as her voice, and her ears, she gave up trying to control them entirely, had tilted forward again, helpless, toward him. Before either of them could say anything further. Before 4 months of careful denial could finally give way to whatever came next, the ship's alarms tore through the corridor, and the deck beneath them shuddered with the impact of debris against the outer hull. Vaelira did not sleep well the night after the bridge incident. She told herself this was due to the residual mortification of having her tail declare itself in front of a visiting admiral, a mortification that was, admittedly, considerable, but some quieter, more honest part of her recognized it for what it truly was. The particular restlessness of a woman who had spent 4 months building careful walls and had just watched every one of them crumble in a single afternoon, with nothing yet built to replace them. She rose before her alarm, dressed in the dim pre-shift light of her quarters, and made her way to the officers' mess earlier than her habit, hoping the quiet hour before the bulk of the crew woke might offer some space to think. She found Orsa there instead, nursing a mug of something dark and bitter that only nominally qualified as tea, watching her with the particular patience of someone who had clearly been waiting. "Couldn't sleep either," Orsa said, not quite a question, gesturing at the seat across from her. Vaelira sat, because refusing would have required more energy than she currently possessed. "I do not require a counseling session, Orsa." "Good, because I'm not qualified to give one. I run a reactor." Orsa took a long sip of her tea. "But I've known you 11 years, Commander, and I've never once seen you look as unsettled as you did on that bridge yesterday. Not during the Kessering mutiny. Not during the reactor scare that put Cross on your radar in the first place. I'd like to know what precisely frightens you more, that your tail wants him, or that everyone else now knows it." Vaelira considered the question longer than she expected to need. "Both, I think," she admitted finally, surprising herself with the honesty of it. "I have built a career on the principle that a commander does not permit her own wants to become visible to her crew. It creates vulnerabilities, points of leverage for anyone who might wish to exploit them. And now half this ship has watched my tail behave like a love-struck cadet, and I do not know how to command a crew that has seen me want something this plainly." "You command them the same way you always have," Orsa said, with the blunt certainty of a woman who had spent 3 decades solving problems with wrenches and straightforward truths. "Competently. Fairly. With enough backbone that nobody on this ship would dream of testing you twice. Commander, I watched you talk down the Kessering mutineers with a sidearm pointed at your own chest. You think a crew that witnessed that is going to think less of you because your tail likes a communications officer? They'll think you're finally human enough to like someone back. I am not human, Orsa. You know precisely what I meant." Orsa's mouth curved, not quite a smile. "The crew doesn't need you invulnerable, Commander. They need you steady. Those aren't the same thing, and I think you've been confusing them for longer than just these 4 months." Vaelira did not have a ready response to that. She sat with it instead, turning the words over the way she turned over difficult intelligence reports, testing them against 3 decades of carefully constructed instinct, and found, somewhat to her own surprise, that she could not immediately locate the flaw in Orsa's reasoning. She was still sitting with it, an hour later, when the alarms began. The Solène Veil had not been designed to weather a debris storm of that magnitude, and everyone aboard knew it within the first 30 seconds. Fleet Command's charts had marked the ferrite debris field as low density, a routine hazard, nothing that warranted rerouting a scheduled inspection flight through a slightly longer but safer corridor. Fleet Command's charts, it turned out, were catastrophically out of date, a fact that would occupy several very unpleasant conversations between Vaelira and Fleet Command in the weeks that followed, once there was time for such conversations again. Vaelira was on the bridge within 90 seconds, uniform still faintly disheveled from the corridor, voice already snapping out commands with the flat precision that had made her legendary among her crew, every trace of the afternoon's mortification burned away by the far more familiar fire of a crisis she knew how to manage. "Shields to maximum forward arc. Petrick, get us angled bow first. I want the reinforced plating taking the impacts, not the hull." "Aye, Commander." "Orsa, report on the reactor." "Holding for now." Orsa's voice crackled over the comm, tight with the particular strain of someone bodily wedged into a service crawl space. "If we take another hit like that last one, I can't promise you for now stays true much longer." The ship rocked again, hard enough to throw 2 junior officers from their stations, and send a data tablet skittering across the deck. Sparks showered from an overhead conduit near the tactical station. Somewhere below decks, a structural alarm began its rising wail, and Vaelira's stomach dropped with a cold, specific dread as she recognized the deck section flashing red on the damage display, before she'd even consciously registered why the number mattered. Communications. Section C7. Daniel's station. He wasn't on the bridge. He'd been rerouted to the secondary communications relay in Section C7 20 minutes earlier, before the alarms, before the corridor, before any of it. Coordinating emergency channels with 2 nearby vessels that had also strayed into the debris field's newly revised boundaries, and Section C7 had just taken a direct impact that had buckled the outer bulkhead and sealed the compartment's blast doors. "Status on C7, Vaelira said, and if her voice trembled at all, no one on the bridge was foolish enough to mention it, not after the afternoon they'd all just witnessed. "Blast doors sealed, Commander." "Compartments holding atmosphere for now, but the bulkhead's compromised, hull integrity's dropping fast. We've got maybe 8 minutes before. Get me a damage control team." "Already dispatched, Commander, but with the debris still active out there, transit time to C7 through the main corridor is—" "I am not asking for an estimate, Lieutenant Van. I am asking for a team." Petrick caught her eye across the bridge, and in his expression she saw the thing she least wanted to see. Calculation. The careful, practiced weighing of risk that every good officer learned to perform in a crisis, and that every good officer knew better than to voice aloud in front of a commander who was clearly no longer thinking with strategic distance, not after the bridge had watched her tail declare itself in front of an admiral not 2 hours earlier. "Commander," Petrick said carefully. The debris field is still active. Sending a team through the outer corridor right now is high risk under the best conditions, and these are not the best conditions. I am aware of the risk, Petrick. I know you are. I'm asking if you're the right person to lead that team, or if you're about to make a decision your tail is making for you. For 1/2 second, Vaelira Thesson. For decades of discipline, a career built on the principle that a commander's place was on the bridge, directing the battle rather than fighting it herself, a lesson drummed into her at the academy as thoroughly as tail discipline had ever been, hesitated. Her tail did not. It had already curled tight, already gone rigid with an urgency that had nothing to do with regulation and everything to do with the small, animal certainty that the person it wanted most in the universe was trapped 8 decks below with dropping atmosphere and a countdown she could not control from a chair. I am the right person, she said, and there was no argument left in her voice, only fact, only the particular clarity that came from finally, completely, ceasing to fight herself. Petrick, you have the bridge. Orsa, I want atmospheric readings on C7 fed to my suit calm the entire way there. Van, keep working that transit corridor. I want a second route map by the time I reach the lower decks in case the first one closes behind me. Commander. That is an order, Petrick. You will have this bridge and I will have that compartment, and both of us are going to do our jobs. The corridor to Section C7 was a nightmare of failing lights and screaming metal. Twice, the deck buckled beneath Vaelira's boots as another impact rocked the ship. Twice, she caught herself against the bulkhead and kept moving, breath coming hard, tail whipping behind her with an urgency that would have embarrassed her in any other circumstance, and that she did not have the luxury of noticing now. A support strut had come loose somewhere ahead, hanging at a drunken angle across the corridor, and she ducked beneath it without breaking stride, boots skidding on a slick of coolant leaking from a ruptured line. The blast doors to C7 were fused shut, the manual release melted into a useless lump of slag by heat damage from whatever had struck the outer hull. Vaelira pried the maintenance panel free with her bare hands, tearing a glove and 2 fingernails in the process, and began rerouting power to the emergency release with the kind of frantic, focused competence that 4 decades of training had built into her bones for exactly this moment. The kind of competence that made her, on any ordinary day, one of the finest officers in the sector, and that now, in the worst moment of her career, felt like the only thing standing between her and losing something she had only just admitted she wanted to keep. Daniel! She hit her calm, static crackling in response, her voice sharper and more raw than she had allowed it to be in front of the bridge crew. Daniel, can you hear me? A long pause, long enough that her hands went momentarily still against the panel, her whole body braced for the silence to stretch on forever. Then, faint and strained. Here. Commander, atmosphere's thin, I can hear it venting somewhere behind the main console. Stay where you are. Do not attempt to move the console. I am coming to you. Vaelira. It was the first time he had used her given name, and something in her chest tightened painfully at the sound of it, stripped of rank, stripped of every careful distance they had spent 4 months maintaining, stripped even of the professional courtesy of commander that he'd clung to through every private conversation since the observation corridor. If the door doesn't hold, it will hold. I am not losing you to a debris field, Lieutenant, after everything else. Not after today. Not after 4 months of pretending my own tail was lying to both of us. The release mechanism finally caught, sparks showering from the panel as the emergency circuit engaged. The blast doors ground open with a shriek of protesting metal, releasing a gust of thin, cold air that smelled of ozone and scorched insulation, and there, through the haze of drifting particulate, and the dim red pulse of emergency lighting, was Daniel Cross, braced against a buckled console, one arm pressed to a gash along his ribs where a piece of shattered paneling had caught him, face pale but eyes clear, alert, alive, and staring at her with an expression she had never seen on him before, something raw and unguarded that no amount of professional distance could have hidden, not anymore, not after everything. Vaelira crossed the compartment in 3 strides and did not stop to think, did not calculate, did not weigh regulation against instinct the way she had trained herself to do for 4 decades. She simply reached him, and her tail, finally freed from every rule she had ever imposed on it, from every rearranged console and carried tablet and rigid wall-facing posture, wrapped tight around his waist and held on as though it could physically keep him from ever being torn away from her again. "You are alive," she said, and her voice, for the first time in front of any member of her crew, was not composed at all. "I'm alive." Daniel's hand came up, unsteady, to rest against the fur of her tail where it curled around him, his fingers finding the softer fur near its base with an instinctive gentleness that made something in her chest ache. "Vaelira, your tail." "I know what my tail is doing, Lieutenant. Everyone on this ship is going to know what your tail is doing. There are 2 damage control officers standing in that doorway right now, and I can see at least one of them already composing the story they're going to tell in the mess hall tonight." She did not, for once, care. Not about the officers in the doorway, not about regulation, not about the 4 months of rearranged furniture and carried tablets and rigid self-denial that had all, in this single moment, come completely undone in a scorched, depressurizing compartment 2 decks from disaster. She simply held on, tail tight around his waist, until the damage control team finished stabilizing the compartment and rerouting emergency power, and the Solen Veil, battered but intact, finally cleared the outer edge of the debris field 40 minutes later to the sound of the entire bridge crew's relieved, exhausted cheering. The medical bay was crowded in the hour that followed, full of the particular controlled chaos that came after any crisis. Minor injuries being tended, damage reports being compared in low voices, the ship's medical officer moving between cots with brisk efficiency. Vaelira had insisted on escorting Daniel there herself, tail still wound loosely around his waist the entire walk from Section C7, and had refused, despite the medical officer's pointed looks, to leave his side while his ribs were examined and bandaged. "Commander," the medical officer said finally, with the weary patience of someone who had served under Vaelira long enough to know when an order would simply be ignored, "I promise you the lieutenant will survive without your direct supervision for the 10 minutes it takes me to finish this dressing." "I am aware of that, Doctor." And yet, Vaelira agreed, without any apparent intention of moving, and the medical officer, sighing, returned to her work. It was Petrick who found them there some time later, having secured the bridge and confirmed the ship's course through the last of the debris field, and who took in the sight of his commanding officer seated at Daniel's bedside, tail curled around the young lieutenant's hand where it rested atop the medical cot, with an expression that mixed profound relief with the particular satisfaction of a man whose long-held suspicions had finally, thoroughly been confirmed. "Ship's secure, Commander," he reported, and then, because he could not quite help himself, "For what it's worth, the whole bridge crew is fairly certain we just watched you break at least 4 separate fleet regulations getting down to C7. Nobody's filing a complaint." "Good," Vaelira said, not looking away from Daniel, "because I have no intention of apologizing for any of them." Petrick left them there, smiling, and word of the exchange had made its way through most of the ship by the time the Solen Veil finished its final sweep of the debris field an hour later. The observation deck of the Solen Veil was the quietest place on the ship, a long, curved viewport lounge 2 decks above the bridge, rarely used except by off-shift crew who wanted to watch the stars in peace, or by officers who needed somewhere private to have a conversation they'd been avoiding for months. Vaelira had chosen it deliberately. If she was going to have this conversation, she wanted it somewhere without an audience, without a bridge crew pretending not to listen, without an admiral watching her tail for evidence of things she had spent 4 months refusing to name, and one catastrophic afternoon finally admitting. Daniel arrived on time, his ribs freshly bandaged by the ship's medical officer, a faint bruise darkening along his jaw where a piece of debris had caught him during the impact, but otherwise steady on his feet, dressed in a clean uniform that made no attempt to hide the sling still supporting his left arm. He looked, Vaelira thought, entirely too calm for a man who had nearly died 6 hours earlier. Then again, he had always been calm in a crisis. It was, she was beginning to admit to herself, one of the things her tail had noticed long before she had, one of the things that had made him worth noticing at all. Commander. He inclined his head, formal out of old habit, though the corner of his mouth was already twitching toward a smile he was clearly trying to suppress. Vaelira, she corrected. I believe we have moved past Commander, Lieutenant, given the circumstances. Given that you used my given name while trapped in a depressurizing compartment, and I have decided, on reflection, that I liked hearing it. Daniel, then? The smile won. You wanted to talk. I did. She turned to face the viewport instead of him, hands clasped behind her back in the posture she used for difficult briefings, because it was easier to say difficult things to the stars than to a person's face, a habit that had served her through every hard conversation of her career and that she suspected would not entirely serve her here. I owe you a confession. An actual one, not the involuntary sort my tail has been delivering on my behalf for the better part of 4 months, in front of increasingly larger audiences, culminating today in an admiral of the fleet and roughly half my bridge crew. I'm listening. Vaelira drew a slow breath. It occurred to her, distantly, that she had faced down Redhari warlords with less difficulty than this, had negotiated ceasefires and disarmed hostile boarding parties and once talked an entire mutinous engineering crew back to their posts with nothing but conviction and a very carefully worded threat, and none of it had required the particular kind of courage this did. My tale revealed something today that I have spent months trying to conceal. I want to be clear about one thing, Daniel, because I think it matters more than anything else I could say to you. My tale did not create what it revealed. It is not some separate creature that fell in love with you independently of my consent, some malfunction in my nervous system that I can blame and disown and pretend has nothing to do with the rest of me. It is simply undisciplined. Honest before I was ready to be, the way tales so often are, the way mine has apparently decided it intends to remain for the foreseeable future regardless of my objections. But the feeling itself is mine. It has been mine since the reactor fluctuation in your second week, when you kept this entire crew calm through pure competence, and I looked at you and thought, for reasons that had nothing to do with instinct and everything to do with genuine respect, that is someone worth knowing. And it has only grown more mine with every month since, every briefing where I found some excuse to stand near your station, every evening I told myself the ache in my chest was simply fatigue rather than admit what it actually was. The words came out stiffer than she intended, more formal than she'd planned, the careful phrasing of someone who had rehearsed this speech a dozen times in the privacy of her own quarters and still could not quite make it sound as natural as she wanted it to. But Daniel did not seem to mind the formality. He crossed the small distance between them and, with a gentleness that undid the last of her carefully rehearsed composure, took her hand in his good one. Vaelira. He said her name like it was something he'd been waiting months for permission to use freely, turning it over with the same care he'd used the first time, in the corridor, when the word had slipped out under crisis rather than choice. You want to know something? I've spent 4 months telling myself the exact same lie in reverse. That it was just your tale. That it didn't mean anything, that a woman with your record couldn't possibly want someone like me, someone who transferred in under a cloud, who spent his first week aboard convinced you'd have him reassigned the moment you found a reason. I told myself I was reading meaning into an instinct you had no control over, that I was a fool for letting myself hope every time your tail curled around my chair, every time your ears tilted my way during a briefing, and you snapped them back so fast I pretended not to notice. He shook his head slowly, his thumb brushing gently across her knuckles. I was wrong. I've been wrong since that second week, too. You've become the person I look for the second I walk into any room on this ship, Vaelira. The person whose voice I listen for on the comm before I even register I'm doing it. That's not instinct. I don't have a tail to blame it on. I just have 4 months of watching you and knowing, with more certainty than I've felt about anything in my life, that I wanted to keep watching. For a long moment neither of them said anything at all. Vaelira's hand tightened around his, and beside them, unhurried and entirely unbothered by the weight of the conversation it had caused. Her tail curled slowly around both their legs, settling into place as though it had simply been waiting, all this time, for the rest of her to catch up to what it had known since the second week of a routine transfer assignment that had turned out to be anything but. "I stopped fighting it," she admitted quietly, watching the stars turn slow and silent beyond the viewport glass. Her ears, she made no effort to control them now, tilted forward, soft and open, toward him. "Somewhere in that corridor, I think. Or perhaps in this room, just now. I am not entirely certain which, and I find, for the first time in longer than I can remember, that I do not particularly care to work out the precise moment. Some things do not require a tactical timeline." "Does it feel better?" Daniel asked. "Not fighting it?" Vaelira considered the question with the same seriousness she gave every tactical assessment, turning it over the way she turned over an intelligence report, checking it against every instinct that had driven her through 4 months of rearranged furniture and rigid postures, and found, for once, that the honest answer required no calculation at all. "Yes." Something low and warm began to build in her chest, unbidden, unfamiliar after so many years of practiced suppression, the beginning of a sound she had not permitted herself to make in front of another living soul since she was 14 years old. She felt it catch in her throat, felt the old instinct to swallow it back rise automatically, and then, deliberately, let it go instead. The purr came soft and low, barely audible, but Daniel's face changed the instant he heard it. Surprise giving way, swift and unguarded, to something like wonder. "Vaelira! Do not remark on it, Lieutenant, or I will find it in myself to suppress it again purely out of spite. I wasn't going to say a word." But he was smiling, wide and unguarded, and his own ears, she noticed, with a fresh wash of warmth, had tilted forward to match hers, an answer offered as plainly as her own. They stood together at the viewport for a long while after that, her tail curled comfortably around them both, content in a way it had not been allowed to be in months, the low sound of her purr filling the quiet observation deck like something neither of them intended to hide again. Eventually, Daniel broke the companionable silence with the faint trace of a smile. "So," he said, "can you order it to behave? Regulation and all that?" "I imagine there's some fleet directive somewhere about appropriate tail conduct on the bridge." Vaelira glanced down at her tail, at the cream-tipped end resting warm against Daniel's leg, utterly unrepentant, tapping its slow, satisfied rhythm against the deck plating. "I could," she said, and for the first time in longer than she could remember, something in her voice was genuinely, unguardedly warm. "But it appears to have better judgment than its commander." The Solène Vale spent the better part of 2 weeks in the aftermath of the debris storm undergoing repairs at the nearest fleet way station, a sprawling orbital facility crewed by an efficient, unromantic staff who cared nothing for choosing season and everything for hull integrity, and who regarded the ship's freshly reinforced bulkheads with the particular satisfaction of engineers who enjoyed a well-documented repair job. Section C7 was stripped down to its frame and rebuilt from the deck plating up, a fact that gave Daniel, once he returned to active duty, the distinctly strange experience of working at a communications console that smelled faintly of fresh welding for the better part of a month. Vaelira used the downtime, ostensibly, to catch up on the backlog of reports the debris storm had generated. In practice, she found herself spending a considerable portion of every day in the way station's public promenade, where Daniel had taken to eating his midday meal at a small kiosk overlooking the observation windows, and where her tail had developed the unshakable habit of leading her there whether or not she had consciously decided to go. "You could simply ask me to eat with you, Commander," Daniel observed one afternoon, not looking up from the datapad he was reading as she settled, with elaborate casualness, into the seat across from him for the 4th day running. "It would save you the trouble of pretending this is a coincidence. I was reviewing the way station's docking schedule. From the promenade kiosk, where I happened to eat lunch. The lighting is better here. Vaelira." He finally looked up, and the warmth in his expression undid whatever remained of her prepared deflection. You don't have to pretend anymore. Not with me. Not after C7. She had set down her own datapad then, with the particular deliberateness of a woman surrendering a position she had defended for months purely out of habit rather than conviction. No, she agreed. I suppose I don't. From that day forward, she stopped pretending entirely. She ate her midday meal at the promenade kiosk without inventing a single tactical justification for it. Her tail, freed from the burden of concealment, took to resting comfortably across Daniel's boot during these meals, tapping its slow, contented rhythm against the deck, and more than one passing fleet officer offered the pair a knowing nod that would once have mortified her, and now simply made her feel, for the first time in longer than she cared to admit, unguarded. Petrick found the whole development insufferably charming, and said so, often, until Orsa threatened to reassign him to overnight coolant monitoring if he did not, in her words, let the woman eat her lunch in peace. The way station's repair yard was not without its own small dramas. A visiting trade delegation, en route to the same diplomatic circuit the Solent Vale had originally been inspected for, arrived mid-repair with an entourage of minor officials who seemed to find the newly public nature of Commander Thesson's courtship a matter of considerable interest. Vulpine bondings among senior fleet officers were, apparently, the subject of some fascination among civilian diplomats who rarely encountered them firsthand. Is it true? One delegate asked her, with the blunt curiosity of someone who had clearly never served aboard a Vulpine crewed vessel, that your tail chose him before you did? I'd heard that was simply an old story, not something that actually happened. Vaelira considered the question for a moment, aware of Daniel standing nearby, aware of her own tail curled loosely and without any concealment at all around the leg of her chair. It is not that my tail chose him before I did, she said finally, with the calm precision she brought to every difficult answer. It is that my tail was honest before I permitted myself to be. There is a difference, though I confess it took me the better part of 4 months and a debris storm to understand it. The delegate seemed satisfied with this answer, and moved on to pester Orsa about reactor specifications instead, but Daniel, catching Vaelira's eye across the repair bay afterward, offered her a small, private smile that told her he had heard every word, and had understood, better than most, exactly what it had cost her to say them plainly. Word travels fast on a ship the size of the Solent Vale, and by the time Admiral Calloran's inspection concluded 3 days later, extended, in the end, by the unscheduled debris storm and the resulting repair assessment, though the Admiral seemed in no particular hurry to leave, there was not a single crew member aboard who did not know, in explicit and occasionally exaggerated detail, exactly what had transpired both in Section C7 and on the observation deck afterward. Orsa Vennik took to greeting Vaelira each morning with a knowing look and absolutely no comment, which was, for Orsa, a remarkable act of restraint that lasted almost a full week before she finally cornered Vaelira in the corridor to demand, with characteristic bluntness, whether the engineering betting pool needed to pay out yet. Petrick Don had the good grace to wait a full week before mentioning, entirely too casually, over a shared meal in the officers' mess, that he told her so, and then proceeded to remind her of it no fewer than 6 more times over the following month, until Vaelira threatened, without much real heat behind it, to reassign him to the supply frigate Daniel had transferred from. Admiral Calloran, for her part, made only one further remark on the subject before departing the ship. Delivered with the dry, weathered humor of a woman who had seen 4 decades of officers deny their tails and had never once seen a tail lose the argument. Choosing season, she said to Vaelira on the gangway before her shuttle departed, her aides already loading data cases into the transport behind her, has a way of being honest whether or not the officer in question is ready for it, Commander. I'd say yours simply got tired of waiting for you to catch up. 4 decades in this fleet, and I have never once seen a tail lose that particular argument. You'd have saved yourself a great deal of rearranged furniture if you'd simply surrendered in month 1. Vaelira, standing at the airlock with her tail curled, without any concealment at all, for the first time in 4 months, comfortably around Daniel's leg where he stood beside her, found she had no argument left to offer. So it would seem, Admiral. For what it's worth, Caloran added, pausing at the shuttle hatch, her expression softening into something almost fond. Your inspection scores were excellent, Commander. Best run ship I've toured this circuit. Your tale's judgment about your crew evidently extends beyond matters of the heart. The weeks that followed the inspection settled into a new kind of rhythm aboard the Solène Vail. Not radically different from the old one, not in the ways that mattered to the running of the ship, but softer at the edges in ways the crew noticed and, for the most part, quietly approved of. Vaelira no longer rearranged consoles or carried tablets as makeshift shields. She no longer stood with her back against walls during briefings, tail pinned flat and miserable against the bulkhead. Her ears, when Daniel entered a room, tilted forward without apology, and more than one junior officer found themselves smiling at the sight of it, at the small, unguarded warmth that had crept into their commander's bearing without diminishing, in the slightest, her authority. The reports still went out on time. The reactor still ran smoothly under Orsa's watchful care. The Solène Vail still handled every subsequent hazard, diplomatic complication, and routine crisis with the same crisp precision it always had. Vaelira Thesson remained, by every objective measure, one of the finest commanders in the sector. She simply no longer pretended, in the process, to be someone whose tale did not know exactly what, and who, it wanted. The bonding ceremony, when it came, 3 months later, was small. Held not with the pomp of full fleet tradition but in the quiet fashion some Vulpine officers preferred, among crew rather than dignitaries, on the observation deck where the truth had first been spoken aloud. Orsa stood witness, dressed in her formal engineering blacks and looking, for once, entirely without her usual dry commentary, though she did manage one remark about the betting pool's final payout before the ceremony began. Petrick, uncharacteristically sentimental for the occasion, gave a toast that made even Vaelira laugh, a rare, unguarded sound that carried the same warmth as her purring, and that the entire assembled crew seemed to treasure hearing. And when the old words were spoken, the ones every Vulpine child learned long before they understood what they meant, about tales and truth and the things a heart chooses long before the mind agrees to follow, about ears that tilt forward without permission and purrs that cannot be taught to lie, Vaelira's tail curled once, slow and certain, around Daniel's waist, exactly where it had always wanted to be, exactly where it had been trying to lead her for 4 stubborn, rearranged, thoroughly undignified months. Outside the viewport, the stars turned on, indifferent and eternal, and for the first time in longer than she could remember, Commander Vaelira Thesson did not feel the need to stand with her back against a wall. She stood instead beside Daniel Cross, her tail curled around him in full view of her entire senior staff, her ears tilted forward without apology, and let herself, for once, simply be exactly as honest as the rest of her had always been trying to tell her to be. The Solène Vail completed its next choosing season with 2 further bondings among her crew, a junior tactical officer and one of the way station's dockhands, and rather to Vaelira's private amusement, Petrick himself, who had spent so many months teasing her about her own tail's behavior that he seemed almost sheepish when his own began behaving with equally little regard for his dignity during a routine supply run. Orsa's betting pool, it turned out, had anticipated neither development, and the resulting payout became a matter of considerable engineering deck legend for months afterward. Vaelira found, in the year that followed her own bonding, that very little about her command had actually changed, in the ways that mattered most. She still ran the tightest bridge in the sector. She still delivered bad news in the same flat, composed tone she used for breakfast orders, still weathered crises with the same unshakable calm that had built her reputation across 7 systems. Admiral Caloran, on a follow-up inspection some months later, pronounced the Solène Vail irritatingly well run for a ship with this much romantic drama aboard it, which Vaelira chose to accept as the closest thing to a compliment the Admiral was likely to offer. What had changed, she reflected one evening on the observation deck, watching Daniel work through a translation backlog at the small desk they had, by unspoken agreement, come to share during off-duty hours, was smaller than anyone watching from outside might have expected, and larger than she could have imagined 4 decades into a career built on discipline. She no longer treated her own instincts as a weakness to be managed. She no longer measured her worth as an officer by how thoroughly she could suppress the parts of herself that wanted things, wanted comfort, wanted nearness, wanted a particular communications lieutenant's low, steady voice to be the last thing she heard at the end of every shift. Her tail, curled loosely and entirely without shame around Daniel's ankle as he worked, tapped once against the deck plating, unhurried and utterly content. She did not need to translate the word. She already knew it by heart. Sometimes, in the quiet hours of a night shift, when the bridge was still and the stars turned slow beyond the viewport, Vaelira found herself thinking back to the version of herself who had spent 4 months rearranging furniture, carrying tablets like shields, standing with her back pressed to bulkheads as though a wall could hold back an instinct that had already made up its mind. She did not judge that woman harshly, though she understood her better now than she had at the time. Discipline had built her career, had carried her through mutinies and diplomatic crises and 31 years of a service record without a single serious blemish, and she did not regret a moment of the training that had made her the officer her crew trusted with their lives. But discipline, she had learned, was not the same as denial, and a tail that would not obey was not, in the end, a failure of command. It was simply the truest part of her, patient and certain, that had known what she wanted long before the rest of her had found the courage to agree. She had spent 4 months trying to command it into silence. She had spent every day since grateful, in ways she still struggled to put into words even now, that it had never once listened. Beside her, Daniel shifted in his sleep, and her tail, without any conscious decision on her part, curled a fraction tighter around him. Outside, the stars kept turning, indifferent and eternal and utterly unbothered by the small, stubborn, entirely undignified miracle of a Vulpine commander who had finally, completely, stopped fighting herself.